Hello, my name is Ciprian and today I'll be presenting my paper on Marketization, Controlling Ownership and CEO Compensation. I worked on this paper together with Lívia, Markóczy, Peng from UT Dallas, as well as Sunny Lee Sun. So, what is this paper about? The research questions we try to investigate on how do institutional changes affect the determinants of CEO compensation. And what we found, our argument, is that CEO of companies that operate in more marketized environment, and I'll be discussing the concept of marketization in a couple of slides. So these CEOs operate in environments that are much more complex from an institutional perspective. They have a higher level of discretion, as well as requiring high level of human capital to lead a larger company, therefore requiring higher compensation. And our second research question looks at how do controlling shareholders, if they are present, how do they affect the determinants of CEO compensation? So we argue that if a controller shareholder is present, they can partially solve the agency problems by aligning the goals of the CEO with those of the shareholders. So let's look at the framework. So this relationships that firm size, the larger firms, is going to lead to higher CEO compensation has been researched thoroughly in extant literature. The second relationship, again, firm's performance, a better performing company is going to lead to more CEO compensation, has also been discussed a lot from the perspective of agency theory. So these are not the main focus of our research, but what we're looking for is two moderating factors: the degree of marketization, which is the pro-market institutional changes that accompany the transition from a plan to a market economy, or in the case of China, from communism to democracy. So we argue that the stronger the level of marketization is going to strengthen the relationship between firm size and CEO compensation, as well as strengthen the relationship between firm performance and CEO compensation. If a controlling shareholder is present, one that has a large number of shares in the company, we argue that they are likely to negatively influence the relationship between firm size and CEO compensation, and instead shift the CEO compensation to focusing more on firm performance. So why this particular study, and why did we choose to focus on China? The goal here was to incorporate institutional change into the principal-agent relationship, thus focusing on the calls to extend agency theory by having an institutional perspective. And the case of China allows us to capture this institutional change geographically by looking at the region by region, because of the heterogeneous institutional changes between the various regions. And also, from the other perspective, China does have a high level of controlling shareholders, and I'll mention who they typically are in the case of China, and this type of shareholder can influence firm behavior. So let's look at managerialism, which was first studied by Burley and Mains in 1932. It argues that the larger the company, the larger the CEO's pay. So lacking external controls, managers and top executives will try to gain firm size in order to get more power, more prestige, status, and higher compensation. However, this can negatively influence returns to the shareholders. But from this perspective, managers don't care so much about the shareholders, not the good guardians of the shareholder needs. They're focusing much more on the self. And empire building here is growth to growth's sake, trying to pursue mergers and acquisition that if have low or negative results for the shareholder, they're good for the CEO themselves. So higher compensation for the CEO regardless to acquisition performance. So in this scenario, the CEO would lower their own exposure by leading larger, more diverse firm. And in this case, company performance is only going to have a satisfying role, just no focus there. So the CEO themselves have much more influence over mergers and acquisition than over firm performance. On the other side, agency theories argues that tries to induce the executive, the CEO, to act in the owner's best interest. So they assume that CEOs are risk-averse, self-centered, as well as utility maximizers for themselves. So agency theory tries to link the pay performance in order to transfer some of the risk from the shareholders to the management. In that way, you can have an incentive alignment. So let's discuss marketization. So what is it? They are typically the pro-market reforms which result in a reduction of government intervention in the economy. So the government takes more of a hands-off approach. So this results in improvement in institution at the various level, as well as better national governance. So the depolitization of the managerial function. Before, state bureaucrats used to have influence over company performance. Now it's more of a depolitized is transferred to the manager. Liberalization of markets as well as privatization. State used to be the main owner. A lot of the companies that used to be sane are now privatized. So there's a transfer of shares from the state to private shareholders. And there's also a transfer of responsibility from state bureaucrats to the company's CEO. So therefore, managers gain a higher level of power, prestige, and discretion over the firm's actions. So we are looking at marketization is because it allows us to capture institutional change geographically on a region-by-region case, again, because of the heterogeneous level of development of institutions. So we argue that there's a state transfer of authority from state bureaucrats to the CEO. So we argue that the higher the level of marketization, this will strengthen the original relationship between firm size and CEO compensation. In a planned economy, the CEO's actions are constrained by state bureaucrats. In a marketized economy, the transfer is going to be done to the CEO. So they have a higher discretion to increase company size, to improve their own power, status, and compensation. And also there's a higher level of human capital that's required to lead larger, more complex firms. So we argue that the level of marketization in the region where the company is headquartered, because they operate in multiple regions, is going to strengthen the relationship between firm size and CEO compensation. Our second hypothesis look at the relationship between the degree of marketization on the original relationship, the linkage between firm performance and CEO compensation. So the more marketized firm, they have a higher focus on company performance, because the companies are much more scrutinized from external factors. And CEOs typically held accountable for the firm's performance. The state safety net that is typical to state-owned enterprises has been removed. So the liberalization of markets leads to much higher level of competition, which leads to performance being the judge between companies. And so the management, also depolitization, shifts the power from state bureaucrats to the CEO. So we argue that the level of marketization, again, in the region where the company's headquarters, is going to strengthen the relationship between firm performance and CEO compensation. The other moderator that we're looking at is the controlling shareholders. So previous literature has shown that concentrating shareholders gives power to monitor firm operations. So in the case of China, we find two typical controlling shareholders. It's either some state-owned enterprises which were only partially privatized, so the state still has some shares, and we see family companies that were originally entrepreneurial and they were partially privatized, and the entrepreneur still holds a chunk of the shares. So we argue that they can potentially control the firm due to their in-depth understanding of firm's operational and organizational complexity. They were the founders that founded the firm's formal institutions, and they do pose a threat to potentially replace the CEO. So they have power both through formal as well as informal institutions. So we argue that the level of concentration of ownership will weaken the positive relationship between firm size and CEO compensation. And instead, by looking at the next hypothesis, we argue that share concentration will constrain the CEO discretion. So the controlling shareholders have the incentives as well as the ability to constrain the CEO to focus on profit maximization instead of empire building. So this way, we argue that the CEO will focus on performance. This will co-align the interests of the shareholders with those of the executive, the principal agent. So we argue that the level of concentration of ownership will strengthen the positive relationship between firm performance and CEO compensation. So let's look at the data. We have a focus on the Chinese firms between 2001 and 2006. So this resulted on 7,240 firm years. They were collected from the Shanghai as well as the Shenzhen stock exchanges from the CSMAR as well as the WIN databases, which have been previously used in literature, the main variables are CEO compensation. We focus on salary and bonus, no long-term incentive plans, because typically they're not found in China. We look at firm size, the log of number of employees per year, and as well as firms. For firm performance, we do not choose return on assets or return on equity because they can be easily manipulated in the context of China, and we chose to look at the log of sales per employees, which has been previously used in literature. This captures the CEO's marginal effect, not that of the stakeholders. So in previous literature has also shown their market-based measures are less efficient in the case of China. The CEO compensation was in inflation-adjusted constant yuans. So the moderating variables, we looked at the Marketization index developed by Fan et al. In 2007, a 12-point index. So it looks at a province-by-province measurement of pro-market reforms. And the controlling shareholder, the second moderating variable, is the controlling the largest holder versus all the shares. And we look at some other control variables, state-owned enterprises, slack, independent director ratio, CEO duality, whether the CEO is also on the board, the presence of a compensation committee, and we also look at CEO education, to measure some of the human resources, anywhere from below college all the way to a doctorate degree. So we do find that intra-province correlation is present because obviously companies are nested in their province. They face similar institution, dialect, or culture. So we use the multi-level analysis with random coefficients. So it has a two-level of hierarchical structure. The firm level being the micro and the province level being the macro. So we found interclass correlations, which explains about 13.4 of the variation. By lagging all independent variables by 1 year, we have 5,650 firm years. So looking at the models, we see that each one of our models is supported, and each one of the models from 1 to 5 explains more from the model. So let me jump to some of our contributions. We argue that marketization strengthens the relationship between firm size and firm performance and CEO compensation. Companies that underwent a higher level of institutional change within in the case of China have a higher level of CEO discretion and require more human capital to lead larger firms. And also that the CEOs that do have more discretion and power are being held from the outside by shareholders as well as independent observers such as banks are held much more accountable for firm performance. If there is a controlling shareholder, according to agency predictions, this would lower the tendency for empire building as well as the CEO's preference to grow the firm, growth for growth sake, engage in empire building. So this will lower this tendency, controlling shareholder, and instead shift that focus of CEO compensation by shifting it to firm performance. Another one of our contribution is our focus on the subnational level of analysis. So not just looking at China, we're breaking down on a region by region cases because of the heterogeneous level of change in institution. And we argue that the institutional level of development influences the determinants of CEO compensation. Thank you for attending our lecture, and have a great day.